At 13, Donald Trump was so unruly that his father sent him away to military school. For most families, that would have been a private crisis, a warning sign, a desperate attempt to discipline a rebellious boy before he wrecked his future. In Donald Trump's life, it became the opening scene of something much larger. That angry, competitive child would grow into a man who stamped his name on towers, casinos, hotels, golf courses, bottled water, steaks, magazines, and television. He would become the living symbol of wealth to millions who never saw his balance sheets. He would survive near financial ruin, public scandal, impeachment, criminal prosecution, and a gunman's bullet. He would lose the presidency, deny the loss, plunge the country into one of its darkest constitutional crises, and then claw his way back to power again. Very few lives can honestly be described as unbelievable. Donald Trump's can, not because every chapter is admirable, not because every triumph is clean, but because the scale of the rise, the intensity of the collapses, and the sheer number of improbable returns feel less like ordinary biography and more like an American epic written by someone who kept rejecting endings. And to understand how Donald Trump became Donald Trump, you have to begin before he was born. Before the towers, before the gold lettering, before the crowds, the lawsuits, the private jets, the red hats, the boardroom catchphrases, the impeachments, and the White House. You have to go back to the family story, because in the Trump world, bloodline mattered, inheritance mattered, and the lessons that shaped Donald were already in motion long before he ever learned to speak. Donald John Trump was born on June 14, 1946, in Queens, New York City, into a family that had already climbed far beyond its immigrant beginnings. His father, Fred Trump, was a powerful real estate developer who had built a substantial business in Brooklyn and Queens. His mother, Mary Ann MacLeod Trump, was an immigrant from Scotland who had arrived in America with almost nothing and entered a world of wealth, aspiration, and social climbing. Their marriage fused two strong currents: Fred's ruthless business discipline and Mary Ann's appetite for status, appearance, and upward movement. Donald was born into comfort, but also into a household where love and approval were filtered through performance, toughness, and results. The Trumps were not merely comfortable. They were ambitious in a way that seeped into the walls. Queens in the post-war era was expanding, transforming, offering new forms of suburban prosperity. Fred Trump was well-positioned to profit from it. He built thousands of housing units for middle-income families and became exceptionally skilled at navigating government programs, tax incentives, and construction economics. He knew how to get things done. He also knew how to squeeze costs, protect his advantage, and think in terms of property, leverage, and dominance. That was the air Donald breathed as a child. He grew up in Jamaica Estates, a wealthy enclave in Queens, in a large and impressive house that quietly announced success. There were servants, order, routine, and social ambition, but there was also hardness. Fred Trump admired force. He was not a sentimental father. He looked at life through a business lens, and he looked at people through a hierarchy of strength. Winners mattered. Weakness did not. Donald absorbed this early and deeply. Among the Trump children, Donald stood out. He was not the oldest, not the obvious heir at first, but he had intensity. He was loud, aggressive, attention-seeking, and constantly pushing against limits. Teachers and family alike saw a boy who liked confrontation, who seemed energized by competition, who did not easily accept authority unless he could bend it to his advantage. That energy might have gone in many directions. In the Trump household, it was interpreted as raw material to be disciplined, sharpened, and aimed. By adolescence, Donald had become so difficult to manage that Fred Trump made a decision that would become one of the defining moments of his son's life. He sent him to the New York Military Academy. It was not a gentle intervention. It was a message. If Donald could not be controlled at home, he would be controlled elsewhere. The family story says this was meant to straighten him out. To impose order before his wildness became self-destruction. But what happened at military school was more complex. Donald did not simply submit. He adapted. The New York Military Academy was rigid, hierarchical, and punishing. There were uniforms, inspections, drilling, rules, consequences. For a boy prone to rebellion, it could have been suffocating. Instead, Trump found something he could use. In a world organized around rank and visible status, he discovered that discipline could be turned into advantage. He played sports, earned leadership roles, learned how to command attention inside a structured environment, and began refining the confidence that would later become one of the most recognizable personas in the world. Military school did not make him humble. It made him strategic. It taught him how hierarchy works, how authority looks, how strength can be performed, and how winning inside a system often depends on understanding its symbols as much as its rules. Trump liked symbols. He liked titles, uniforms, visible markers of success. He liked being seen as the strongest person in the room. These instincts would later define everything from his architecture to his politics. Even as a teenager, he seemed drawn not only to success, but to the theater of success. After military school, Trump attended Fordham University for 2 years, then transferred to the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. That transfer mattered because Wharton carried prestige, and prestige mattered enormously to him. At Wharton, he studied economics with a focus tied to real estate, preparing for the world he intended to enter. He was not, by most accounts, an intellectual visionary or campus philosopher. He was focused on the practical: business, property, money, deals, and the family enterprise waiting for him in New York. The late 1960s were a time of upheaval in America. Campuses were alive with protest, counterculture, anti-war activism, generational rebellion. But Trump seemed largely untouched by the ideological passions of the era. He was not building his identity around social movements or abstract political theory. He was building it around advancement. The family business was his horizon, and unlike many young men of his generation, he emerged from those years not disillusioned with American capitalism, but eager to dominate within it. When Trump graduated in 1968, he entered a world that already had a lane prepared for him. The Trump family company, then known as Elizabeth Trump and Son, was stable, profitable, and grounded in apartment construction and management in the outer boroughs. Fred Trump had built a machine that worked. He understood middle-income housing, financing, and local power structures. For many sons, inheriting such a business would have been enough. For Donald, it felt too small. This was one of the first major fault lines in his life, the difference between his father's model of success and his own. Fred Trump built quietly compared to what Donald would later do. He was rich, but not mythic. He was influential, but not glamorous. He cared about profit more than fame. Donald wanted both. He didn't want to be a successful builder in Brooklyn and Queens. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted the skyline. He wanted headlines. He wanted the world to see his success from blocks away. That appetite shaped his early career. He joined the family business and quickly began pushing toward larger, riskier, more visible projects. New York City in the 1970s looked, to many, like a place in decline. Crime was high. The fiscal crisis shook confidence. Certain neighborhoods decayed. Investors were wary. But in periods of urban distress, fortunes can be made by those willing to take big risks and negotiate aggressively. Trump looked at a wounded city and saw a stage on which he could reinvent both his career and his name. One of the most critical early tests came with the Commodore Hotel, a faded property near Grand Central Terminal. The building was rundown, the economics were complicated, and the city itself was desperate for development. This was not a straightforward purchase. It required tax abatements, political support, partnerships, and audacity. Trump moved through the deal with a key mentor beside him, the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was one of the darkest and most influential figures in Trump's development. Cohn had gained fame and infamy during the McCarthy era, helping drive anti-communist hearings marked by intimidation and ruthless tactics. He later became a feared fixer in New York, a man connected to politicians, wealthy clients, underworld figures, and the dirty mechanics of power. His advice to Trump was simple and brutal. Attack, counterattack, never apologize, never admit weakness. These lessons did not create Trump's instincts, but they validated and sharpened them. If Fred Trump taught Donald to prize winning, Roy Cohn taught him how to wage war in public. With Cohn's help and his own relentless deal-making, Trump secured the Commodore arrangement, partnered with Hyatt, and transformed the property into the Grand Hyatt, which opened in 1980. It was more than a successful development. It was a declaration. The mirrored exterior, the scale, the publicity, the association with a major brand, all of it signaled that Donald Trump was no longer just Fred Trump's son working the outer boroughs. He had entered Manhattan. And he had done it with spectacle. That mattered because Trump understood something many traditional developers didn't. In a city like New York, media attention could be converted into leverage. If people believed you were rising, they wanted to be near you. If journalists wrote about you often enough, your name itself became an asset. From the beginning, Trump courted the press with obsessive energy. He called reporters, fed gossip, planted stories, exaggerated his success, and learned how to turn page 6 fascination into real-world advantage. He wasn't just building projects. He was building Trump. Then came the project that crystallized everything. Trump Tower opened in 1983 on Fifth Avenue. Trump Tower was not just a building. It was a statement of identity cast in glass, brass, and marble. Its atrium glittered. Its surfaces gleamed. It announced luxury without understatement. It mixed retail, office space, celebrity appeal, and high-end residences under one giant flashing idea. This is what success looks like. And right at the center of that idea was the name, displayed with unmistakable confidence. Trump was no longer merely the surname of a real estate family. It had become a luxury brand. Trump Tower accomplished several things at once. It established Donald as a high-profile Manhattan developer. It gave him a headquarters that doubled as a media stage set. It offered a physical symbol of excess, at exactly the moment American culture was becoming obsessed with excess. And it elevated him from businessman to character. He was no longer just someone who owned buildings. He was the man whose name on a building seemed to mean glamour, gold, and victory. The 1980s embraced him because he seemed to embody the decade's fantasies. This was the era of Wall Street ambition, visible wealth, oversized egos, and public celebration of winning. Donald Trump fit perfectly. He gave interviews in which he spoke in superlatives. He appeared in glossy magazines. He cultivated the look. Dark suits, long ties, polished surroundings, beautiful women, private planes. He became the face of a new kind of capitalist celebrity. One part mogul, one part showman, one part tabloid prince. His marriage to Ivana Trump reinforced the myth. Ivana, born in what was then communist Czechoslovakia, was glamorous, disciplined, athletic, and formidable in her own right. She was not a background figure. She helped shape the public image of the Trump enterprise and held real roles in the business. Together, Donald and Ivana became a fantasy of international wealth and ambition. They were photographed constantly, moving through parties, properties, and public spaces like a royal family designed by Manhattan tabloids. They had 3 children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, each of whom would later become important in Trump's public and business life. Yet even in the middle of that glittering ascent, a shadow within the family was impossible to ignore. Donald's older brother, Fred Trump Jr., had been the son many assumed would follow their father most directly. But Fred Jr. was different, more easygoing, less brutal, less drawn to the hard-edged world of Trump real estate. He became an airline pilot instead, a decision that did not earn admiration from Fred Trump Sr. The family dynamic was painful. Fred Jr. struggled with alcoholism and died in 1981 at the age of 42. The impact of that loss on Donald Trump was profound and lasting. He often cited his brother's alcoholism as the reason he never drank alcohol or smoked cigarettes. But the lesson went deeper than personal abstinence. Fred Jr. Fate became, inside the Trump family story, a cautionary tale about softness, about failing to fit the family mold, about what could happen when a man did not harden himself enough for the expectations placed upon him. Donald did not talk about vulnerability much, but the fear of weakness seems to run through his life like an electric wire. Fred Jr. story helped wire it there. As the 1980s progressed, Trump expanded with spectacular confidence. He moved into Atlantic City casinos, attracted by the glamour, scale, and potential of the gaming world. He bought the Plaza Hotel, one of New York's most iconic properties, treating it almost like a jewel to be possessed. He purchased an airline shuttle. He acquired Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, turning it from a historic estate into one of the centers of his later political and social universe. He bought a giant yacht. He attached his name to more and more visible symbols of wealth. Each move fed the public narrative that Trump was not merely rich, but triumphant on a mythic scale. This was also the period when he published The Art of the Deal, the book that helped cement his public reputation as the master negotiator, the man who saw possibilities others missed, the killer closer, the human embodiment of winning. The book, shaped significantly by ghostwriter Tony Schwartz, became a defining artifact of the Trump legend. It presented him as energetic, intuitive, fearless, and constantly in motion. Whether or not every claim inside it matched reality mattered less than the impression it left. Trump had found another medium through which to turn his persona into capital. But beneath the shine, danger was accumulating. Trump's empire was increasingly built on debt. He had expanded aggressively, borrowing heavily on the assumption that rising values, continued growth, and his own deal-making prowess would keep everything afloat. For a while, that seemed plausible. Then the economy changed. Markets softened, casino revenues disappointed, interest burdens became punishing, and suddenly, the larger-than-life empire looked dangerously overextended. The early 1990s brought Trump to the edge of ruin. Atlantic City became a major source of pain. His casino projects had promised huge returns and giant visibility, but they also carried huge costs and debt obligations. The Plaza Hotel bled money. Real estate conditions worsened. Bankers who had once funded his rise now faced the possibility that the Trump empire might collapse under the weight of its own leverage. For any businessman, that would have been devastating. For Donald Trump, whose power depended so much on the image of invincibility, it was catastrophic. Headlines shifted from admiration to skepticism and mockery. The same tabloids that had celebrated his wealth now gleefully cataloged the signs of strain. The man who had made himself into the face of success was suddenly associated with excess, overreach, and impending failure. At the same time, his personal life exploded into public scandal. His marriage to Ivana was collapsing under the pressure of his affair with Marla Maples, an actress and television personality whose relationship with Trump became front-page material. The divorce was public, ugly, and intensely consumed by the media. The breakup shattered the carefully managed image of the glamorous Trump family and replaced it with something messier and far more sensational. For most public figures, this combination of financial distress and tabloid humiliation would have been annihilating. But Trump's story rarely follows the ordinary path. He negotiated with bankers, restructured debt, surrendered some control, sold assets, and kept moving. Importantly, he preserved the most valuable thing he had left: the brand. Lenders often concluded that Trump alive and visible, however weakened, was more useful than Trump destroyed. So they cut deals. They extended terms. They gave him room. He had become too large a character, too publicly entangled with his properties, for a clean collapse to serve everyone's interests. This period taught Trump one of the central lessons of his entire life. If you can remain visible enough, loud enough, and valuable enough as a symbol, institutions may hesitate to bury you completely. He emerged from the near ruin not as the same kind of businessman he had been before, but as something more hybrid, less dependent on owning everything outright, more dependent on licensing, branding, and the monetization of his persona. That shift was essential. Instead of trying only to rebuild the old empire brick by brick, Trump increasingly sold the name itself. Buildings, products, ventures, and projects could borrow the glamour of the Trump brand, whether or not he had the deepest traditional ownership stake. In other words, he turned identity into infrastructure. The name became a business model. He also expanded more deeply into golf, acquiring and building courses that fit his love of branding, prestige, and curated status. Golf properties offered something he valued greatly: beautiful landscapes, high-end clientele, luxury aesthetics, and an environment in which the Trump name could be displayed as synonymous with exclusivity. Over time, golf became one of the most stable and visible segments of his empire. But the real resurrection came not from real estate or golf. It came from television. In 2004, NBC launched The Apprentice. The concept was perfect for the version of Trump the culture was ready to consume. Contestants would compete in business challenges. Trump would observe, judge, and ultimately dismiss the weakest with a cold final line. "You're fired." It was simple, theatrical, and devastatingly effective. The show did not investigate his finances or the full complexity of his business history. It offered something much more powerful: a distilled image of authority. In The Apprentice, Trump was not the over-leveraged developer of the early 1990s. He was the boss, the decider, the billionaire commander of a corporate kingdom. He sat at the head of the table, surrounded by anxious aspirants waiting for his verdict. It was myth-making at industrial scale. Millions of viewers absorbed a version of Donald Trump that emphasized power, instinct, and certainty. Week after week, the show reintroduced him to America as the man in charge. This mattered more than almost anything else in his life up to that point. Television did for Trump what even the biggest buildings could not. It reached deeply into the country, beyond New York. It made him familiar to people who had never read about Manhattan, real estate, and never cared about casino debt. It transformed him from celebrity businessman into a national archetype. He was no longer merely a rich man. He was the cultural shorthand for decisive success. The boardroom persona on The Apprentice became one of the most important political assets ever accidentally manufactured. Long before he ran for president, millions of Americans had already internalized the idea that Trump was the kind of man who made tough decisions, hired winners, eliminated losers, and never seemed uncertain. That image would later overpower all kinds of factual complications, because images often travel deeper than footnotes. During these years, Trump stayed politically loud, though not yet fully committed. He flirted with presidential politics in previous cycles, and was always happy to position himself as the outsider who could fix what weak politicians had ruined. He spoke about trade imbalances, foreign exploitation, immigration, and national decline. He was watching the public mood, testing phrases, measuring reactions. In his own way, he was conducting years of soft focus grouping through media appearances. One of the most revealing and consequential preludes to his political rise came during Barack Obama's presidency. Trump became the loudest mainstream promoter of the lie that Obama had not been born in the United States. The birther conspiracy was baseless, ugly, and racially charged. Yet it resonated with a segment of the public already primed by suspicion, identity anxiety, and contempt for establishment narratives. Trump's role in spreading the claim was a warning of what was coming. He had found a political lane where confrontation, conspiracy, racial undertone, and media domination could be fused into one attention-commanding package. Many observers treated birtherism as clownish or disgraceful, and assumed it would permanently discredit him. Instead, it raised his political profile among voters who felt ignored or enraged by the political and cultural establishment. Trump was discovering that, in the modern media environment, violating norms could be more advantageous than respecting them, especially if norm-breaking made supporters feel represented in their fury. Then came the moment that changed the country. In June 2015, Donald Trump descended the golden escalator inside Trump Tower to announce his candidacy for President of the United States. The setting was almost absurdly on brand. Gold, cameras, cheering supporters, a staged entrance in the building that symbolized his success. He looked less like a politician starting a campaign than like a monarch unveiling a new phase of empire. And then he spoke in the blunt, combative language that would redefine American politics. He attacked immigration. He attacked trade deals. He attacked political correctness. He attacked the competence of the people running the country. He declared America was losing and promised, again and again, that under him it would start winning. The speech was inflammatory, simple, repetitive, and unforgettable. It broke rules immediately. It frightened some people, thrilled others, and grabbed the media by the throat. Most experts thought his campaign was a vanity project or a publicity stunt. But Trump was not running a normal campaign because he was not a normal candidate. He brought decades of name recognition, a massive instinct for media, a reality television understanding of conflict, and a message that connected with voters who felt dismissed by both parties. He did not speak in polished policy paragraphs. He spoke in emotional strikes. People did not have to agree with every detail to feel the force of what he was expressing. Humiliation, anger, resentment, pride, revenge. The Republican primary became a graveyard of assumptions. Governors, senators, and establishment favorites lined up to stop him. He mocked them, branded them with insulting nicknames, turned debates into dominance contests, and treated every attack as a chance to seize more attention. His opponents often sounded like politicians. Trump sounded like disruption itself. He was louder, more memorable, and less constrained. He understood that, in a crowded media landscape, the candidate who creates the most arresting moments can drown everyone else. His rallies were central to this rise. They were not standard political gatherings. They were tribal performances. Trump riffed. He attacked elites, mocked opponents, fed grievances, repeated emotionally charged lines, and created an atmosphere where politics felt like catharsis. Supporters did not merely attend. They participated. They laughed, chanted, booed, and fused their identity with the movement around him. He gave them not only positions, but permission. Permission to be furious. Permission to reject polished speech. Permission to feel that they, through him, were finally punching back. By the time he won the Republican nomination, he had already shattered the idea that traditional credentials were necessary to lead a major party. Yet many still believed the general election would stop him. His opponent, Hillary Clinton, had experience, organization, and institutional support. Trump had scandal, chaos, and sky-high disapproval. But he also had energy, obsession-level media attention, and the ability to make every day of the race about himself. The 2016 election became one of the most dramatic and psychologically charged campaigns in modern American history. Trump positioned himself as the wrecking ball sent to demolish a corrupt order. Clinton offered experience and competence, but struggled to match the emotional voltage of his insurgency. Then came the Access Hollywood tape, a moment many believed would end Trump's candidacy forever. The recording captured him making crude comments about women. The backlash was enormous. Republican leaders recoiled. Pundits announced the race was over. But Trump endured. Again that pattern. Again that refusal to collapse. He apologized just enough to stay in the fight, then redirected, attacked, and kept moving. His supporters, many of whom had already invested in him as a vessel for their anger at elites, did not abandon him in the numbers needed to finish him. They had become inoculated against scandal by repetition and by belief that the institutions condemning him were themselves corrupt. Then came election night. As the returns rolled in, the map began shifting in ways that stunned the political world. Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the so-called blue wall cracked. Counties that had voted Democratic for years swung hard. Rural turnout surged. White working-class voters in key states delivered an electoral revolution. Against the polls, against the expectations of much of the media, against the assumptions of both parties, Donald Trump won the presidency. The shock was immediate and global. For his supporters, it was a victory of the forgotten over the arrogant. For his critics, it felt like a national rupture, proof that celebrity, grievance, and demagoguery had conquered the republic. For Trump himself, it was the ultimate vindication, the greatest brand leap of his life. No building could top it. No show could rival it. He had gone from Manhattan promoter to commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful nation. But once in office, he did not become less Trump-like. If anything, the presidency amplified his core instincts. He governed through tension, surprise, personal loyalty, and public combat. He used Twitter not as a side channel, but as a daily weapon. He bypassed normal communication structures and spoke directly, often impulsively, to tens of millions. Cabinet secretaries, aides, chiefs of staff, communications directors, national security advisors, and lawyers came and went at dizzying speed. Many entered believing they could channel him. Many left burned, humiliated, or dismissed. The White House often felt less like a stable institution than like a nerve center for continuous conflict. And yet beneath the chaos were significant achievements that reshaped American government. Trump signed a major tax cut. He pursued deregulation aggressively. He tightened immigration policy, including controversial travel restrictions and hardline border measures. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and other international arrangements he saw as constraining American sovereignty. He renegotiated trade deals and made economic nationalism central to his political identity. Most importantly, for many conservatives, he transformed the federal judiciary, appointing 3 Supreme Court justices and a large number of lower court judges. These decisions would shape law and policy long after his first term. At the same time, investigations stalked him relentlessly. Questions about Russian interference in the 2016 election and possible coordination with his campaign led to the Mueller investigation, which examined links, obstruction, and a presidency already saturated with suspicion. Trump responded the same way he usually did, by attacking the investigators, the press, and the legitimacy of the process itself. To supporters, he was being hunted. To critics, he was behaving like a man with much to hide. The national divide widened. Then came the first impeachment. In 2019, Trump pressed Ukraine to announce investigations that could politically damage Joe Biden, while congressionally approved military aid was being withheld. The House of Representatives impeached him for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. It was historic, but the Senate acquitted him. Trump emerged enraged, relieved, and even more convinced that survival itself was proof of strength. Then history delivered him a challenge no amount of branding could easily tame. A global pandemic. COVID-19 hit in 2020 and shattered normal life. Schools closed, cities emptied, hospitals filled, economies convulsed. Fear spread faster than certainty. For Trump, the crisis was uniquely dangerous because it demanded patience, consistency, public trust, and empathetic discipline. Instead, his response veered. He sometimes emphasized the threat, sometimes minimized it, sometimes pushed optimistic timelines that failed, sometimes clashed with public health experts, and often treated the politics of the crisis as inseparable from the science. Masks, lockdowns, vaccines, reopening, and the language of the pandemic all became polarized. Then the country erupted again after the killing of George Floyd. Protest movements surged. Some demonstrations were peaceful, others turned destructive. Trump leaned hard into law and order rhetoric, presenting himself as the defender of stability against unrest. He saw opportunity in polarization and moved toward it. If the country was splitting, he intended to dominate one side of the split absolutely. The 2020 election against Joe Biden unfolded in this atmosphere of fear, rage, isolation, and exhaustion. Trump warned for months that widespread mail voting would produce fraud. He primed supporters to distrust the process before the votes were even cast. Election night initially seemed favorable to him in some key places, but as mail ballots were counted, Biden pulled ahead and won. Trump refused to concede. This was another decisive turning point in his life and in American history. Rather than accept defeat, he launched a campaign to overturn the result. Lawsuits challenged outcomes in multiple states. Public claims of fraud were repeated constantly, often without credible evidence sufficient to alter any result. Local officials, state officials, lawmakers, and even his own vice president came under pressure. Supporters were told not that they had lost, but that victory had been stolen from them. This lie built toward January 6, 2021. On that day, as Congress met to certify the Electoral College results, Trump addressed a crowd in Washington and urged them to fight. Thousands moved toward the Capitol. Some stormed it. Police were assaulted. Lawmakers fled. The seat of American democracy was breached in scenes that shocked the world. The images were unforgettable. Smashed windows, Confederate symbols inside the Capitol, terrified staff sheltering, the certification process halted by violence. It was one of the most stunning breakdowns of the peaceful transfer of power in American history. Critics saw it as the inevitable product of Trump's rhetoric and refusal to accept reality. Supporters offered varying defenses, but the damage was done. A second impeachment followed, charging him with incitement of insurrection. Once again, he was acquitted in the Senate. Once again, formal removal failed. When he left office, many assumed his political life was finally over. The logic seemed overwhelming. He had lost re-election. He had been impeached twice. His presidency ended in chaos. Social media platforms curtailed his reach. Donors hesitated. Allies distanced themselves. Surely this time, the saga had reached its final act. But Donald Trump's career has rarely obeyed the assumptions of people convinced they are watching the end. At Mar-a-Lago in Florida, he rebuilt. The resort became his post-presidential court. Lawmakers, candidates, donors, media figures, and movement loyalists came to seek favor. He remained the emotional center of the Republican Party. Candidates feared primary challenges if they crossed him. Endorsements from Trump still mattered. The party had changed around him too much to easily move on. His voters still saw him as the rightful leader, and his enemies still treated him as the central threat. That combination kept him at the middle of everything. Then came the legal storms. Trump faced multiple indictments, something without precedent for a former American president. Charges emerged in connection with hush money, classified documents, efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and alleged interference in Georgia's vote count. The symbolism was immense. Courtrooms, arraignments, fingerprints, a mugshot, the visual language of criminal accountability, wrapped around a man who had already occupied every other extreme of American public life. And yet these events did not destroy him inside his party. In many ways, they strengthened him. He turned every prosecution into a proof point. He argued that the system was weaponized, that prosecutors and political enemies were trying to stop him because they feared not just him, but the movement behind him. His supporters believed him or wanted to believe him. Each indictment became not just a legal event, but a rallying device. He transformed defendant status into campaign energy. This was one of the strangest and most revealing chapters of his life. Most politicians try to survive scandal by becoming smaller, quieter, more careful. Trump survived by becoming larger, louder, and more defiant. He treated the courtroom and the campaign trail as connected theaters. He was not just a candidate facing charges. He was, in his narrative, the persecuted champion fighting a corrupt regime. Then, during the 2024 campaign, history took an even darker turn. At a rally in Pennsylvania, gunfire broke out. Trump was struck in the ear. Chaos erupted. Secret Service agents rushed to cover him. Blood ran down the side of his face. For a moment, the nation watched in horror as another chapter of political violence opened before its eyes. And then came the image. Trump rose, bloodied but standing, and thrust his fist into the air as supporters roared. Cameras captured the scene instantly. It became one of the defining political photographs of the age. In that single instant, the Trump mythology condensed again. Danger, violence, defiance, survival, spectacle. For supporters, it felt like destiny. For opponents, it was terrifying. For everyone, it was unforgettable. He used the moment, as he had used so many others, not with quiet reflection, but with narrative force. The shooting became one more chapter in the saga of the man who could be targeted, wounded, hated, prosecuted, and still remained standing. If previous scandals had reinforced his supporters' belief that he was persecuted, the attack raised that belief to something near sacred. As the 2024 election unfolded, the Trump campaign drew on every layer of his long public life. The businessman who promised winning, the television boss who projected command, the populist insurgent who attacked elites, the victim of investigations, the survivor of an assassination attempt. He was no longer simply running as a former president. He was running as a legend under siege. And then he won again. Donald Trump returned to the White House as the 47th President of the United States, completing one of the most astonishing comebacks in American political history. Defeated in 2020, written off after January 6, indicted across multiple fronts, shot at on the campaign trail, and still, he returned. It was the kind of arc that would sound implausible in fiction, because fiction usually demands cleaner logic than reality. To understand why he keeps surviving, it helps to look beyond the events and examine the engine beneath them. Trump's power has never been only about policy. It is about emotional occupation. He seizes attention. He becomes the center of narrative gravity. He makes supporters feel represented not in the polite language of government, but in the blunt force of grievance, pride, and revenge. He makes critics react so intensely that they, too, end up feeding his centrality. He polarizes completely, and in that total polarization, he remains unavoidable. His speaking style, often mocked as rambling or chaotic, is part of that power. He uses repetition, blunt adjectives, superlatives, mockery, rhythm, and emotional coding rather than polished explanation. He speaks as if he is thinking in public. Even when he is strategically repeating themes he knows work. To critics, this can sound incoherent. To supporters, it feels authentic, unfiltered, unmanipulated by consultants. In a political era marked by distrust, sounding polished can be a weakness. Trump understood that instinctively. Family has also remained central to his biography in unusual ways. Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric grew from children in the tabloid era to public players in the Trump empire and political ecosystem. Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner entered the White House in senior advisory roles that blurred lines between state power and family dynasty in ways unprecedented in modern America. Trump trusted family in part because family, to him, signaled loyalty in a world he saw as full of betrayal. But family also extended the brand. The Trumps were not just relatives. They were characters in a larger ongoing saga. Melania Trump added another layer to that story. Born in Slovenia, she brought elegance and mystery into a family otherwise defined by constant exposure. As First Lady, she remained more guarded than almost anyone around her husband. That reserve made her stand out in a universe where so much was performative. Their marriage, often dissected and speculated upon, became another symbol onto which the public projected narratives about power, distance, loyalty, and image. The contradictions in Trump's life are part of what make him so compelling. He presents himself as the tribune of ordinary Americans while living amid extreme luxury. He attacks elites while craving elite recognition and adorning himself with the symbols of high status. He rejects institutions while seeking to dominate the most powerful institution in the world. He claims to speak plainly while also manipulating narrative relentlessly. He insists he is authentic, yet lives inside branding to an almost total degree. These contradictions would cripple a more conventional politician. For Trump, they often deepen the fascination. That may be because he is not experienced by supporters primarily as a checklist of ideological consistency. He is experienced as a force, a breaker of things, a representative of fury, a man who seems to enjoy combat as much as victory. He tells people the world is rigged, then offers himself as the battering ram. Even when he fails to solve the problems he names, many supporters feel he is at least fighting the enemies they blame. His critics, meanwhile, see a different pattern. They see manipulation, authoritarian instinct, indifference to democratic norms, contempt for truth, racial provocation, self-enrichment, and an appetite for personal power, unlike anything modern America has tolerated in a president. They see a man who discovered that spectacle could shield corruption, that constant lying could exhaust accountability, and that direct emotional connection with supporters could overpower institutional warnings. Both sides, in their own way, are responding to the same core reality. Trump changes the atmosphere around him. He does not enter a system and simply operate within it. He stresses it, bends it, personalizes it, and turns it into a stage for his own struggle. In business, television, and politics alike, he treats structures as arenas. That is why his life feels so narratively addictive. Each chapter is not merely an event. It is a contest of will. Look at the pattern from the beginning, and the continuity is striking. The difficult child sent away, then rising within military hierarchy. The young heir rejecting the safe limits of his father's business. The outer borough developer's son conquering Manhattan through attention as much as architecture. The glamorous mogul transforming wealth into myth. The overextended empire crashing under debt. The humiliated celebrity surviving by preserving his name. The reality television boss rebuilding authority through performance. The political provocateur learning that outrage itself could be capital. The outsider candidate smashing a party from the inside. The president governing through permanent conflict. The defeated incumbent refusing defeat. The exiled former leader recasting prosecution as martyrdom. The wounded candidate rising bloodied to his feet. The comeback victor returning to power. Again and again, the same currents drive the story. Ambition, hierarchy, projection, grievance, survival, domination, and the refusal to let any defeat remain final. His father's influence remained a long shadow over all of it. Fred Trump built the material base and implanted the core psychology. In Fred's world, life was a competition and softness was dangerous. Donald absorbed that view and amplified it until it became a worldview. But he also diverged from Fred in a crucial way. Fred built wealth. Donald built spectacle. Fred wanted profitable buildings. Donald wanted visible monuments. Fred knew how to navigate local government and housing economics. Donald wanted the skyline, the cover story, the camera, the myth. And then there was Ry Cohn, whose influence on Trump's combat style can hardly be overstated. Attack, deny, counterattack, never apologize, never admit error, always frame any accusation as evidence of the accuser's corruption. These instincts became almost automatic in Trump's public life. They shaped his legal posture, his press strategy, his debate style, his response to scandal, and his approach to governing. If Fred Trump laid the emotional foundation, Ry Cohn sharpened the weapons. Yet for all the steel in Trump's public persona, there are flashes in his biography that hint at the emotional vulnerabilities he works so hard to bury. His fear of weakness, his reverence for strength, his need for loyalty, his obsession with being seen as successful, even when success is under question, his fixation on humiliation, both avoiding it and inflicting it, his constant effort to dominate the story before the story can dominate him. These are not random traits. They form a coherent psychological pattern, stretching across his entire life. Consider his relationship to place. Trump often attached his identity to properties with symbolic power. Trump Tower, the Plaza, Mar-a-Lago, his golf resorts. These were never just investments. They were stages on which he could present a version of himself. Architecture for Trump was branding made physical. Buildings did not only house tenants or guests. They radiated meaning. Gold, marble, scale, chandeliers, immaculate lawns, imposing entrances, private clubs, grand ballrooms. He liked environments that told visitors they had entered a world of rank and power. In that sense, his properties were autobiographical. Mar-a-Lago, especially, became more than an estate. It became a throne room for his later life. Originally built by serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, the property was transformed by Trump into a club that mixed luxury, exclusivity, politics, and self-mythology. As president, it was often called the Winter White House. After the presidency, it became headquarters, refuge, court, and symbol all at once. Supporters saw it as the stronghold of a leader in exile. Critics saw it as the gaudy palace of a man who could never separate personal brand from public power. Both readings were, in different ways, true. The same can be said of Trump Tower. For years it functioned not only as a building, but as a vertical monument to the Trump persona. It was where he lived, worked, made announcements, and staged himself. Its golden aesthetic became synonymous with his taste. Maximal, assertive, unashamed of opulence. Some saw vulgarity. Others saw aspiration. Trump understood that taste itself is political. To many Americans, his style looked like success with no apologies. His media instincts deserve special attention because they are among the most decisive gifts of his life. Trump has always understood headlines emotionally, not just intellectually. He knows what images burn into memory. He knows that outrage often travels faster than explanation. He knows that if people are talking about you, even to condemn you, you remain central. This gave him enormous advantages in the tabloid age, in reality television, and later in the algorithmic age of political communication. When social media emerged as a dominant force, Trump was uniquely suited to it. His language was direct, provocative, fragmentary, and emotionally loaded. It translated naturally into short-form blasts that could drive news cycles in seconds. He did not need the old gatekeepers in the same way previous politicians had. He could speak over them, around them, through them. Traditional institutions still mattered, but they no longer controlled his relationship to his audience. That shift helped make his rise possible and made controlling him far more difficult. There is also the matter of truth. Trump's biography cannot be told honestly without acknowledging how often he is stretched, distorted, or disregarded factual accuracy. He exaggerates crowd sizes, victories, wealth, support, danger, betrayal, success, failure, and history itself. But what is striking is that these exaggerations are often not random. They serve a narrative purpose. They enlarge his stature, minimize his defeats, magnify his enemies, and keep the emotional stakes high. For Trump, truth is frequently subordinate to force. If a claim rallies people, humiliates an opponent, or shifts the frame, he may repeat it regardless of conventional standards of accuracy. This is one reason historians and journalists struggle with him. He is not merely someone about whom falsehoods circulate. He is often an active producer of them, and he does so with instinctive understanding of how repetition creates belief in polarized communities. Yet reducing him to falsehood alone misses something. His supporters do not follow him only because they believe specific claims. They follow him because he validates feelings and identities they believe other leaders ignore. Facts matter, but emotional alignment often matters more. And that is part of the larger American story reflected in Trump's life. He rose at a time when trust in institutions was fraying, inequality was widening, cultural conflict was intensifying, and media fragmentation was making shared reality harder to sustain. Trump did not create all of those conditions, but he exploited them brilliantly. He became the avatar of a country arguing with itself about class, race, identity, masculinity, nationalism, truth, In power, even his body language became political language. The forward lean, the pointed finger, the extended handshakes turned into dominance tests. The scowl, the smirk, the public fury, the raised fist after the shooting. Trump's politics were always physical as well as verbal. He performs strength with his whole body. Supporters read that as confidence. Opponents read it as intimidation. Either way, it communicates force. Then there is the simple question of scale. Trump does not do small. He does not narrate events modestly. Every victory is huge. Every crowd is enormous. Every deal is the greatest. Every betrayal is historic. Every threat is unprecedented. Every comeback is total. This language has often been mocked, but it is central to how he keeps people hooked. He tells life as if it is happening at maximum intensity, and because he is often the protagonist of genuinely extreme situations, the style does not always feel entirely disconnected from reality. It amplifies the drama already present. That dramatic instinct is why his biography lends itself so naturally to storytelling. The scenes are vivid. The escalator ride, the mirrored tower, the casino floors, the boardroom on television, the election night shock, the impeachment proceedings, the empty streets of pandemic America, the Capitol under siege, the mug shot, the blood on his face at a rally. Each image feels like a chapter break, a cliffhanger, a new season of a saga that should have ended already, but somehow hasn't. There are few public figures in American history whose lives combine so many distinct identities. Trump has been heir, developer, socialite, husband, tabloid obsession, author, casino owner, airline owner, football league investor, beauty pageant owner, reality television star, political conspiracy promoter, president, impeached president, defeated incumbent, defendant, and president again. Each role could have defined someone else's life entirely. In Trump's story, they stack on top of one another until the cumulative effect becomes almost surreal. What remains constant through all of it is his instinct for narrative control. Trump does not merely want to win events. He wants to define what the events mean. If he is investigated, it must mean persecution. If he loses, it must mean cheating. If he is attacked, it must mean destiny. If he returns, it must mean vindication. This is not unique to him in some absolute sense, but the scale and persistence with which he applies it are extraordinary. That is also why he inspires such absolute reactions. To supporters, he has strength in a weak age, blunt truth in a lying culture, patriotic defiance in the face of elite contempt. To critics, he is a warning about the fragility of democracy, the corrosion of truth, the glamorization of cruelty, and the danger of a leader who places self above law. Between those poles, there is very little neutral ground. Trump consumes the middle, and so the life of Donald Trump remains one of the most gripping biographies of modern times, not because it offers neat moral clarity, but because it offers relentless escalation. Every time the story seems to stabilize, it mutates. Every time the public thinks it knows the final frame, another chapter tears it open. He rose from privilege, but turned privilege into mythology. He suffered failures, but converted failures into comebacks. He entered politics as a joke to many, then reshaped the republic. He lost power, denied the loss, faced unprecedented consequences, and returned. Think back to that first image, the 13-year-old boy being sent away because he was too hard to handle. In some sense, the entire rest of his life can be read as an answer to that moment. He would not be mastered. He would not be made small. If forced into a system, he would climb it. If excluded from a stage, he would build his own. If disgraced, he would re-enter louder. If cornered, he would fight. If struck, he would stand back up with blood on his face and his fist in the air. That is not a moral defense. It is a description of the force that has driven him. Donald Trump's biography is the story of ambition without modesty, image without restraint, conflict without fatigue, and survival without surrender. It is a story of a man who saw early that modern power belongs not only to the competent or the qualified, but to the unforgettable. He made himself unforgettable long before he made himself president. And once he understood that attention could be turned into capital, and capital into celebrity, and celebrity into political power, he spent the rest of his life expanding the formula. In another country, in another era, Donald Trump might have remained a flamboyant businessman or tabloid curiosity. But America, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, proved to be the perfect habitat for his talents. It rewarded reinvention. It worshipped wealth. It blurred fame and authority. It fragmented into media tribes. It lost trust in institutions. It grew addicted to spectacle. Trump did not simply emerge from that America. He became one of its most concentrated expressions. And that may be the deepest reason his life matters, beyond the man himself. His story tells us something unsettling and revealing about the culture that elevated him. It tells us how easily celebrity can merge with legitimacy, how grievance can outweigh coherence, how performance can overpower convention, how a public figure who understands attention better than accountability can keep re-entering the center of the frame. From Queens to military school, from military school to Wharton, from Wharton to the family business, from the family business to Manhattan, from Manhattan Towers to Atlantic City casinos, from casino debt to television resurrection, from television to political insurgency, from insurgency to the Oval Office, from the Oval Office to impeachment, from defeat to denial, from denial to indictment, from blood on a rally stage to the presidency again. It is one of the strangest, loudest, most consequential journeys ever lived in public. And whether history finally remembers Donald Trump as a national savior, a national trauma, a democratic warning, a master showman, or some combination of all of them, one fact is already beyond dispute. He altered the course of American life in ways that will echo for generations. He bent media, politics, law, and party identity around his personality. He made his private instincts public doctrine. He took the logic of branding into the highest office on earth. He made the presidency part throne, part studio, part battlefield. For some, that was liberation. For others, catastrophe. For all, it was transformation. And so the biography of Donald Trump is not just the story of one man's rise. It is the story of how a man trained by family pressure, seduced by status, armored by combat, and empowered by mass attention, turned himself into one of the defining forces of his age. A boy sent away to be disciplined became a figure who would challenge the discipline of institutions themselves. A developer who wanted Manhattan ended up claiming the country. A celebrity who loved cameras became the subject of history's most relentless spotlight. A man who could never bear to lose made losing politically intolerable, then tried to rewrite the terms of defeat itself, and a figure dismissed again and again as finished kept returning, each time more improbable than before. That is why his story remains so magnetic. Because Donald Trump's life does not move in straight lines. It moves in shocks, in reversals, in spectacle, in fights that become identity, in collapses that become relaunches, in crises that become mythology. It is the story of a man who made himself the headlines so thoroughly that even history struggled to look away. And in the end, that may be the most Trumpian truth of all. He did not simply live through the age of celebrity, outrage, and political theater. He mastered its rules, weaponized its incentives, and then climbed to the top of its biggest stage. He turned biography into branding, branding into power, power into conflict, and conflict into survival. That is Donald Trump, a man shaped by ambition, hardened by competition, fueled by grievance, obsessed with victory, and defined above all by the refusal to accept any ending that he did not choose himself.